Hello, my friends. I really do feel like I'm among friends, although I can't see you. I'm so grateful to be able to spend this time with you, and thank you for the warm welcome. Sometimes I walk into rooms and that's not the welcome I get. At one point, I was asked by the College of Social Work at the University of Utah to come in and explain traditional marriage views from a Latter-day Saint perspective to their cohort of students working on their Masters in Social Work. And I was really excited to do it. I said, I'd be happy to. And I must have come across as a little too zealous or a little too naive, because the professor that asked me to come said, you do realize you'll be in the minority, right? That most of the people there that you're talking to will not agree with your view. And with the same big smile on my face, I said, oh no, yeah, this isn't my first rodeo. I'm used to that. I welcome that. And so by all means, let me come. I walked in to this room, and one of my students happened to be in that cohort. I didn't realize. I walked in and she immediately burst into tears. And I thought, wow, do I have that effect on people? And I sat down next to her because there was a few minutes before it started. And she just said, I asked her, are you okay? And she said, I am so grateful you're here. And I said, why? And she said, well, knowing what we were going to be talking about today, I knew this would be hard. This young woman was a convert to the church and loved the gospel, but also loved her classmates and realized that many of them were never members of the church or former members of the church that had really strong feelings about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And she said, I just feel on certain topics there's all kinds of tension and friction and opposition. And knowing you, when I saw you walk in, I knew today was going to be hard. And then to realize they're not going to hate me today, they're going to hate you today. And I thought, I'm happy to be your human shield. I'm honored to be able to do that. But it was interesting to start, knowing that there was that tension from the very beginning, to say to the group, to kind of to break the ice, I let them know, I am so grateful to be here, and I'm even more grateful that you're here. And I particularly mean those of you who do not agree with what I'm about to say. I'm really grateful, and not just here in this program, but here in this university and here in this state. I'm grateful. My PhD is in American religious history. I study anti-religious rhetoric. And what's interesting, when I studied early Puritanism and realized that when they came to New England, there were all kinds of craziness going on because of the homogeneity. Everyone was kind of the same. They'd been different from the Anglicans that they were breaking away from in England, and there was always somebody else to compare themselves to and feel superior to. And then they all came to New England, and it was all the same. And they looked around and said, I have to be better than somebody, so who can I be better than? And it's ourselves, so that's going to ratchet up hypocrisy and perfectionism and all kinds of things. And when that made sense to me, all of a sudden, Pioneer Utah made a lot more sense to me. And I realized we have to be able to associate with people that we disagree with. And so I said to this group, it's thanks to you and the proving of contraries that you allow. It's thanks to you pulling in a different direction. It keeps me from getting weird, or it keeps me from being any weirder than I already am. So thank you for disagreeing. I do so much work with people that are struggling in their faith. And what was said this morning by Governor Cox about needing to be better at disagreeing, to do that as members of the church with those outside of our faith is one thing, and something we have to get better at. But to do that with people that are in our faith but aren't sure if they want to stay in our faith, to do that with people who have left the faith, that's something we have to get better at ourselves. Because I study, thank you. I had done a fireside that was filmed and posted on the internet, and I guess it was doing enough good for people that some former Latter-day Saints that attacked the church decided to attack me. And they did a tribute video, I guess you could say, where they took my fireside apart and just tried to delegitimize it point by point. My wife said afterwards, like, are you okay? That's actually happened twice, and the second one was even more brutal than the first, and my wife was like, honey, emotionally, are you okay with being attacked like that? And 20,000 people just watched you skewered online, and people are swearing at you in the comments, and I said, yeah, I understand where they're coming from. If they're mad at the church, and I can be the whipping boy, I'm fine to take that. She just laughed and said, man, you have thick skin. You were made for this, weren't you? To study anti-Mormonism and to try to help people navigate those paths. I said, well, maybe I was. I'm just sad that you had to marry this level of insensitivity. And she said, well, touche, touche. But my hope is that we can all develop not just thick skin, but soft heart. That's a tough combination. So we can engage in those kinds of conversations. The reason I say this, years ago, my mother-in-law called my wife and I. I love my mother-in-law. She's ruined every good mother-in-law joke because none of them apply to her. She's incredible. And she called us early on in our marriage and she said, I want you to hear it from me first instead of somebody else down the grapevine. I'm leaving the church. I'm having my name removed from the records, and I just hope that we can still be family and I can still be part of the grandkids' lives and so on. And I've said, of course, Mom, that wouldn't change anything. We're grateful that you would tell us. But the part that I struggled with most, by the end of the conversation, and we expressed our love and our support and our desire for her to continue to be a part of our lives as close as possible, I said, the one thing that I regret, Mom, is this. I answer questions for a living, and you never asked me a single one. And I regret that on my part. I just wondered, what could I have done differently so that you would have been comfortable asking me questions all along the way? So we could have talked about things, supported you earlier on. The question I sometimes ponder is what keeps other people from asking those kinds of questions? And you probably can think of all kinds of good answers. The simplest and shortest one might be this: we do. What keeps other people from asking their heartfelt questions, the ones that are really wrestling with their faith and struggling whether or not they'll stay in the church? Sometimes it's on us. We haven't created safe enough space for them to do so. Listen to this email I received from a student of mine years ago. Within the past 12 months, I've experienced a faith crisis, if you will. I found myself hurt, betrayed, confused. Many of you, I'm sure, have been there or perhaps are there right now. I began to question everything and found myself doing the best I could to attend church. Can you sense the desire on his part to stay? Doing everything he can. I want to still be a part of this. There is power and there's truth and there's goodness here, but there's also questions I cannot resolve. So what do? I began to find myself questioning everything. I wanted to go to church, but afraid to voice my concerns, raise questions, discuss this faith crisis with others, I stopped attending for the past several months. When I began to raise my concerns, respectfully, of course, I was shunned by friends and ward members. I haven't attended church in months, but I wanted to find a place for me still in the church, even though I felt that the church had pushed me out. I decided to attend your institute class, which was completely selected at random last night. I think he did so because the class had like 400 people in it, met in a chapel, and he could sneak in the back and sit in the corner and not have anyone see him enter or exit the room. But the interesting thing about this night for him was we were talking about a subject that was near and dear to his heart because it was near and dear to his questions, what he was wrestling with. And at a certain point in the lesson, he said, I had to ask my question. But sitting in the back, I was so afraid to ask it because I knew if I did, a bunch of heads would turn to see the apostate in the back corner. He said, my hands were trembling, but I had to ask. And so there I was, trembling hand raised, and you called on me. The way he described it, I asked my question and had a few students turn around and look at me. Sure enough, just what he'd feared. But I knew I needed to ask that question, and I needed an answer so bad. When you said we would cover that question next class, I look at my roommate, who's very active, and expressed to him how grateful or how glad I was. I felt rejuvenated in finding a place for myself within the church. Now, the only reason we were going to talk about it the next period is because we'd run out of time. But what was interesting, when he asked his question and everyone was, who would have asked such a thing? I looked down and smiled and I said, I am so glad you asked that, because if you didn't, I was going to. And I clicked the next slide on the presentation, and it was his question in my words. This is an absolutely essential thing for us to wrestle with. We can't take the naive approach and just chalk it up that, it must be true, that's what it was said. How do we navigate the difficulties and the nuance, the complexity of these kinds of issues? He and I ended up having amazing conversations one-on-one in my office, where he could really ask any question he wanted and feel like he had a safe conversation partner. And that's what I'm hoping to create in all of us in the next few minutes, is safe conversation partners that for those who are afraid of asking their question, who not only have trembling hands to raise, but often a trembling hand they keep from raising because they don't want to raise concerns in other people. I worry sometimes that on our side, we fear questions because we think it's the first domino that's going to fall. And a question must be a doubt waiting in the wings, and that's a concern, and that's apostasy, and that's rebellion. And we've seen, especially if their testimony has teetered and their beliefs start to fall to the point that their faith is wavering, well, we have to keep them from asking those kinds of questions. And the exact opposite is true. I think so often in our fear, and that's often what's motivating us, our fear to allow people to ask questions, we put our hand down there to keep the dominoes from falling. And what we ended up doing was cause the dominoes to fall in the opposite direction. And there goes their faith, fearing that if it can't handle questions, then what am I holding on to? And there goes my belief, and there goes my testimony. There's a problem here. To me, I've often heard people say, in response to those who say, Latter-day Saints, the church isn't welcoming to questions. I just feel like I can't ask them. And the usual response I get is from people that say, what are you talking about? The restoration began with a question. Read the Doctrine and Covenants. Most of those revelations came on the backs of honest questions and real concerns, real people in real life situations. Now, I do like that response. The restoration began with a question. But the more you think about it, I don't think that's accurate. The restoration didn't begin with a question. The restoration began with the reassurance that questions are welcome. And that's what spurred Joseph Smith. So confused, wondering what to do, James 1:5 was absolutely life-changing for him because it gave him the reassurance that he lacked. It didn't answer his question. It told him he was allowed to ask it. And the rest is history. If any of you, and that any is all-inclusive, there's not some special group that's permitted to ask questions or allowed to wrestle with difficulties. If any of you lack wisdom, and notice it's wisdom that you're wondering about. It's not an evidence that you're lacking faith or you're lacking conviction. You're lacking answers. You're lacking an understanding of something, and that is totally normal because it's totally human. So if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask. Just allow it to happen. Allow people to come. Allow them to raise their hand. Welcome these kinds of questions. Let them do it. And let them ask God. Let them ask you. Let them ask your neighbor. Just let them bring up those things. And think about what God does in this promise. Who giveth to all, again, radically inclusive, who giveth to all liberally. It's amazing to know that God is a liberal. When it comes to answering questions, he wants to pour out truth. Well might man put forth his puny arm to turn back the waters of the Missouri River, to keep God from pouring down revelation upon the heads of the Latter-day Saints. He's asking us to ask. Show some interest. I had a student once said that his mission president told them, if your investigator never asks you a question, they're not really investigating. And I thought, that explains a lot of dates I went on when I was young. They really weren't interested. And so to let them ask, to encourage that kind of curiosity with the promise that you will give liberally and not upbraid. I will not look down on you for asking a question. And best of all, it will be given. What will be given? That wisdom. Along the way, that empathy, that understanding, that compassion. And what I love about Joseph's mind and heart catching hold of that promise is that he said, if that's true, and he was going to take this leap of faith, trusting that it was, if that's true, then I might venture. And that's such a powerful word, that this is an adventure for him, and he's going to have to venture. He's going to have to walk into the dark, hoping that God is true to his word and he's not going to be upbraided. We have to give that kind of reassurance to people that their questions are more than welcome. The question is, will we even have the opportunity? Here, Bishop Newell K. Whitney was told to search after the poor to meet their needs. It wasn't a matter of just wait and have them come to you. You go out and search those who need your help. They might be too shy to ask for it. And if we can do that, searching after the poor in spirit, making sure that they know that we are a welcome and safe conversation partner. A friend of mine years ago said he got a secret, unofficial calling in his ward that changed his life and changed the ward's life. It was an experience unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was a new ward that had been cobbled together from bits and pieces of a bunch of other wards. And this wonderful older gentleman was pulled aside by his bishop, and he said, I want to give you a calling, but nobody can know about it. I'm not going to sustain you in sacrament meeting. This has to be an incognito opportunity for you. And he's like, I'm intrigued. What do you want me to do? And he said, I need you to be the ward grandpa. He said, what do you mean? He said, this ward has no unity because we're all been thrown together, and we need a grandpa that loves everybody. Stock up with Werther's Originals or something, but come to church every chance that you have and love the children and love the adults and bring us together in one. And this friend of mine said it was the best calling he ever had in the church. So my hope today is to give all of you a secret, unofficial calling that you'll never be sustained to fulfill. But it's the calling to be a safe conversation partner for anyone in your circle of influence that might have a trembling hand that they're afraid to raise. I have tried to do that for the last decade. As I've been studying anti-Mormonism and seeing what people are up against, trying to understand those who have already left the church and to reach out to them and say, if you need to come and get closure, if you have questions to ask or concerns to wrestle with, if you just need a good pair of shins to kick, I have two. And people come out of the woodworks. I had one student say to me once, I'm so grateful that at the end of practically every class, you would invite us. If you have specific questions about this, if you're wrestling with these issues, if you want to talk more about it, my office hours are any hour that I'm in my office. And if I'm not in it, then here's my cell phone number, here's my email address, reach out and let's talk. And one student said, I'm grateful you said that often enough that I actually started to believe that you might mean it. Can you get a sense of Joseph? If that's true, then I might venture. Can we do that? When I was in Tennessee, I was studying at Vanderbilt for my PhD at the Divinity School. And to be a token Latter-day Saint in the Bible Belt was absolutely fascinating. And I happened to be there during the Mitt Romney campaign, which made it even more exciting. Because it's the South, so everybody wanted to vote Republican, but it's the Bible Belt, so nobody wanted to vote for a Latter-day Saint. So everyone was concerned and wanted to know more about the church so they'd be comfortable voting for the Antichrist. And they would reach out to me left and right. I remember this one student said, I just got hired by another church to teach about your church, and I don't know enough about it to do it justice. Can we get together for coffee so you can explain your church to me? And I said, man, if you're inviting me for coffee, you really don't know anything about my church. So yeah, so we went to Starbucks, and she drank, and I ate, and I talked, and we had an amazing conversation. But like 2 hours into it, she thought, wow, your church is so much more rich and deep and complex than I thought. I'm out of my league. Would you mind coming with me to teach about your church? And I smiled. I thought you'd never ask. So I went. It was the coolest introduction I'd ever received. She came in and said, today we're going to be going through the next couple of weeks talking about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is so much deeper and theologically richer than I imagined. And so I brought my Mormon with me. And I thought, I'm somebody's Mormon. Everybody deserves a Mormon of their very own. And I was so thrilled to just become the Mormon for this congregation. And I let them know, I'm here to answer whatever questions you might have. And I tried to reassure them from the start, none of your questions are inappropriate. None of them will hurt my feelings. I have very thick skin and everything's welcome. Everything's on the table. I learned that you have to do that because of a conversation I had at the Disciples of Christ Church in Nashville. This one, there's some history between the Disciples of Christ and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And they'd asked me if I'd come and explain the church to their congregation. I said I'd be happy to. But a day or two before the event took place, the pastor called and said, we're a little nervous about you coming. And I said, really? That makes two of us? But why? You have home court advantage. Why are you worried? And he said, well, we're worried about the rules of hospitality. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, you're a guest in our congregation, so we fear that we're supposed to be nice to you. I said, oh. Well, in that case, I'm flattered. I'm honored that you would be concerned about my feelings, but please reassure your congregation I don't have any to hurt, and so everything's on the table. They can ask anything they want, okay? In fact, I said to him, a few of my students had wanted to come to watch the conversation unfold. I'm going to uninvite them because I can't vouch for the thickness of their skin. That way I'll be the only Latter-day Saint in the room and they can ask anything they want. And when I got there, I reassured them that that was indeed the case. For them to feel comfortable asking the questions that were really gnawing at them, they had to know that I would not get defensive. Later, I was doing a similar thing to the Presbyterians, and I had just been, in some of my historical research, I'd found a letter from a Presbyterian minister that was concerned about the explosive growth of the Latter-day Saints in Joseph Smith's period. And he wrote a letter to another fellow Presbyterian minister, and he said, these Mormons are just multiplying like flies, and the Baptists are being led astray, and the Methodists are falling prey, but not many Presbyterians are joining their church. And this minister was so proud that the Presbyterians seemed to be immune to it. And then I walked into this Presbyterian church, and I said, I shared this story with him. And I said, I'm not here to be defensive. So again, ask any questions you want. But neither am I here to be offensive. I'm not going to do that either. I don't have my missionary tag on. I'm not here to convert anyone. This is not a covert missionary operation. This is a chance for you to ask anything you want. And plus, based on this letter that I just studied, you guys are all immune to the restored gospel anyway. So no worries. And again, it just lightened the mood in that room, and they really felt like they could ask anything. Honestly, I was so tempted during the whole Romney campaign to make a t-shirt that said, I'm a Mormon, you can ask, and just kind of walk around Nashville and let people ask whatever they wanted. See, here's the challenge. What do you see in this picture? Your eye is probably drawn to this big question mark, and that's the focus. There's a question here, there's a concern, there's an issue. But look closer, and what is really there behind the question mark? Behind every inquiry is an individual, and behind every question is a quest, and that quest is a personal one. To understand the human, the living, breathing, experiencing person with their trembling hand. When I was still in Nashville, the APs would come to Institute every week. At one point they said, Brother Halverson, there's a missionary that's going home because of anti-Mormon literature. You study that stuff. Would you mind talking to him before he leaves? And I said, if your mission president allows it, I'd be honored. So the mission president gave the green light, and I remember driving to the chapel to meet this missionary and praying, saying, Heavenly Father, this better be a one-hit wonder, because I've got one shot to help this young man with all of his struggles. Please help me connect with him from the very beginning. And the Lord provided a miracle to allow that to happen. There was instant trust, and when I started to say, okay, Elder, I hear you've dug into some things and learned some things that are difficult. How can I help? What are your questions? And he felt really comfortable. He said, well, there's these multiple accounts of the first vision. I'm like, oh, that's what you want to talk about? Awesome. 1832, such a good one. The 38 that's canonized is fine too. But then when he got these little twists in 35, and he's like, but what about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon? What about the translation issues? I'm like, oh, that's what we're talking. Okay, well, that's an amazing experience as well. When you compare this and then revelation by dictation versus translation by depiction, and how does it? And he's like, but what about the Mountain Meadows Massacre? I'm like, oh, that's what we're talking about? And I start going there and the historical context, and but what about plural marriage in the Joseph Smith period? I'm like, oh, and it felt like we were playing whack-a-mole at Chuck E. Cheese until I realized this young man doesn't want answers. He prefers the questions. He doesn't want them resolved. And I thought, why is that? He won't let me answer any of these questions before he jumps to a different one. So I just backed off and I said, you know, Elder, I love this. Great questions. You're a real thinker. This is awesome. I'm just curious, though. What do you think of Tennessee? What do you think of Nashville? How long have you been out? And as I sat back and let him explain his story, he was a Greenie missionary that had come from an affluent area and had never had to do anything really hard, and his mission was the hardest thing he'd ever done in his life, and it was killing him. To the point that I cannot do this for 2 years. But I don't want to go home with my tail between my legs. And so he started searching for opposition. He started searching for questions so that he would have something justifiable to say, because of intellectual honesty and integrity, I could no longer continue to preach things I didn't believe in myself. All of a sudden I realized his real question is the person behind the question mark. And he needs empathy and understanding, because missions are hard, especially when you're a Greenie. And I just started telling him about my early mission and how hard it was for me. I told him my favorite day as a Greenie was August 1st. And he said, what happened on August 1st? And I said, nothing. But I got to my mission in July, and it was the first day that I could move the calendar page, and I had evidence that time had actually passed on my mission. I remember meeting a guy who'd been out for 6 months, and I said, how was your mission? And he just beamed. He said, I love it. And I honestly thought to myself, you're lying. At what point does the mission president say, you tell the greenies you like it. I don't care if you don't. You tell the greenies. And I thought, that's not going to be me. I'm going to be honest, if I can last that long. Friends, I still teach the gospel now because it's the closest thing I can be to being a missionary. And I wasn't doing it to lie to the greenies. But I just empathized with this young elder and said, it gets better. It's creation, fall, atonement. We've talked about that in here before too. But get through the fall, and the atonement will be glorious. And he decided to stay. In fact, we started laughing. I'm like, what'd you think about the anti-Mormon questions you were asking? Were you so convinced by them you were going to go home and deconvert your family? And he just laughs. No, I didn't even understand half the questions. I'm like, I know, I could tell. But to open up those kinds of conversations, and I think most of us are afraid to do it because they think, well, you have to have the PhD in American religious history. You have to have studied all the anti-Mormon arguments. Occasionally that knowledge base is helpful. But so often what people needed from the very beginning is a non-judgmental heart, an open ear, and an invitation to just come and join them on a difficult journey. That's what it boils down to. And all 3,000 of you can do that starting now. I'm begging of you. I'll put it this way. I cannot keep up with the requests. I have 300 emails waiting in my inbox of people that are desperate. Please talk to my spouse. Please talk to my child. Talk to my parent. Please, can you sit down with our whole family and be a moderator and mediator trying to patch up the true believers and the former members and how to navigate these things? I can't keep up with it. Because the most effective way of doing it is the least efficient way of doing it, which is one-on-one. Some people will say, I just need like 15 minutes of your time. I got a quick question about race in the priesthood. And I'm like, a quick question about race in the priesthood. That one I spend usually 2 hours on each time I address it in a classroom setting. But for this conversation, we're going to need at least 2 hours. And they're like, what? It's just a short question. I said, but you're not a short person. And I need to know the whole backstory and how you were raised and what's your experience been. I need to be able to validate the experiences you've had that are hard, and I need to empathize with every emotion that's come as a result. I need to know you, and that's going to take a while. But you already know them. And if you can start that process, I remember I had a conversation with a friend that was going through a brutal divorce. It wasn't at the divorce stage yet, but it seemed like it was getting close, and I didn't know the details, so I didn't know how to help. So I said to him, we were on a car ride together, and I said, I need you to know 2 things about me, in case you forgot. Number 1, I am one of the least curious people on the planet when it comes to other people's business. And I need you to know that because I know something's going on in your life, and I don't know the details, and I will not pry. I'm not going to dig in. I'm not going to share rumors. I'm not going to gossip about the situation you're in. I'm not curious enough, if you want to put it that way. But there's this other side of me you need to know also. I'm one of the least judgmental people you'll ever know. And I say both of these because if you want to tell me nothing, then I'm not going to pry. And at the other extreme, if you want to tell me everything, I'm not going to judge. And I need to lay out those parameters so that you feel safe. Anywhere in the middle, you can talk and say as much or as little as you choose. And in that moment, he just kind of looked at me and then smiled and said, thanks. And that was it. I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to prove I'm non-invasive. I'm not, okay, great. But a day or 2 later, he called me and said, are you really okay for me to move a little closer to the non-judgmental side? And we had an amazing conversation. I want to show you, I'm going to skip a little bit to show you something at the end. Here we go. Just yesterday, I'd been asked to speak at an interfaith suicide prevention summit. I never cancel class. I love my students too much. I don't want to share with other substitutes. But I cancel class for this cause because suicide hits close to home for me. And to spend a day with people that are trying to help one another. And one of the things that came out most strongly is people who are struggling, who are wrestling, who are on the verge of catastrophe, do they have someone to talk to? Is there a conversation partner that they feel safe with? And when you think about faith crisis, what is faith to us? What is religion? It's been defined as ultimate concern. What happens when ultimate concern becomes ultimately concerning? Faith is your connection to the ground of all being, it's been said. But what happens when the ground of all being starts to crumble beneath your feet? Faith is your lens on reality, but what happens when reality starts to unravel? Faith crisis is literally when the sky is falling, capital S, and heaven seems to become crashing down to earth, and what do? It's that devastating. And so to have conversation partners, my talk yesterday was called Keeping Loss of Faith from Becoming Loss of Life. It can be that serious. And so we need an army of people willing to go and save people. So let me conclude with one last brief story, because this is odd. It's never happened to me before or since. I was at a fireside with some friends, and in the middle of the fireside, the Spirit whispered crystal clear, and that hardly ever happens to me. Scriptures pop into my mind, but not words, but these are the words that came. Your friend is going to ask you for a priesthood blessing at the end of the fireside tonight, and you are not to give him one. Huh? What happened to let him ask of God, and it'll be given and liberally and not upbraid? Well, at the end of the fireside, we were talking. I was trying to allow it to happen, and nothing happened. So I thought, well, maybe I got my wires crossed. So I went to the car, about to leave, and then he ran out to the parking lot and said, I was trying to play stupid. I'm like, everything okay? What do you need? And he said, do you have to leave right now? And I said, no. Why? And he said, could you give me a blessing? Now, how do I respond? Thus saith the Lord. No, I was like, okay, I'm always here to help. What's going on? And he described the weight of the world on his shoulders and these decisions that he'd have to make. And he said, I just don't want to mess it up for my family's sake. I need all the help from heaven I can get. And I said to him, how's your wife feel about all the decisions that you're trying to make? Are you guys on the same page yet? I'm just wondering if the two of you maybe talk more and then come together, and maybe you both need blessings. I don't know, but why don't I give the two of you some time, and then we can schedule a time to do a priesthood blessing a little bit later. And he said, and he started to weep. And he said, I'm sorry that I was using the priesthood as a get-out-of-work card and just expecting you to get the answer from heaven for me and then hand it over. You're right. I've got to make this decision myself. I'm going to go to the temple tomorrow, and I'm going to go session after session until I know the answer for myself. And I paused him right there. I said, you haven't been listening to me. What's your wife going to be doing when you're at the temple all day tomorrow? Home with the kids? This is a decision that affects your family. So the two of you have to make the decision together. And then as clear as I could, and bolder than I'm used to, I said to him, you're not getting a blessing from the priesthood because you married your blessing. It's all right there. And as the two of you work to become one and figure things out, the answer will come, the confirmation will come. I'm not trying to ask any of you not to turn to God. That's the ultimate invitation, right? Let him ask of God. But I do wonder sometimes, is that the only one we can turn to? And is it desperate because no one else a little closer to home is willing to say, come and you can ask? I testify that you married your blessing. And your siblings with your blessing, and you're the blessing for so many people in your ward. I testify of God's goodness in pouring out more revelation than we know how to handle, but also of filling our lives with people who are able to help. I pray, my friends, that you and I can trust the person and trust the process and trust the Lord enough to let them ask. Thank you.